To begin the questioning, just a few opening questions. First, Ambassador Booth, you talked about any measure being on the table. You might want to elaborate a little bit. Of course, this is a time of some heightened hope, but we know that hope coupled with the credible threat of a downside, a sanction, personal especially, can sharpen the mind. The impact on food security, or food insecurity, more appropriately termed, on vulnerable persons. Since it is very hard to get food aid as well as medicines to targeted populations, what impact do we know, Mr. Levitt, you might want to speak to this, is having on the elderly, children, particularly pregnant women? We know the great game changer of the first 1,000 days from conception to the second birthday. Is any of that happening now in Sudan? Are we about to see a period of stunting and other kinds of consequences, maladies that could be prevented? 15,000 child soldiers, is that accurate? Is it more or less? What's being done to reintegrate those kids? John Pendergast says that one factor not addressed, and he goes on to talk about the main driver being unchecked greed. He talks about looting frenzy, violent kleptocracy, looting and killing with impunity, but he suggests that the one factor that has not been addressed is this issue of unchecked greed. Your response to that? And Matt Wells, in his comments, points out that in February, Senegal, Angola, UK, and France supported an arms embargo and suggests that U.S. leadership has been lacking on an arms embargo. If the U.S. were to strongly support an arms embargo, it's likely that the position would prevail in the Security Council. Your reaction and thoughts on that?
Chairman Smith, I'll begin with the impact on the elderly and the children regarding the situation. USAID is concentrated on the situation affecting the most vulnerable people in the country. Just to give you an example of how we're targeting children and elderly. In the case of children, USAID provides health and nutrition assistance to some of the most vulnerable in some of the most dangerous and vulnerable areas in the country. What that translates into, what that looks like is an example of a 8-month-old boy in the state of Jonglei late last year, got malaria, got terribly sick, got dehydrated, and became less than 8 to 10 pounds in weight. The mother carried that boy for 6 hours to get to the first accessible clinic. That was funded by USAID's partner, IMA Health International. That organization provides specialized therapeutic assistance to that child and nutrition support. That child gained back 3 pounds over the course of 5 weeks. And at that point in time, the mother was able to care for the child and to bring the child back home. This assistance, the health assistance and nutrition assistance that USAID and its partners bring to bear, sometimes in remote and dangerous areas, makes a significant difference. In terms of children and elderly, also making sure that our activities do no harm and our activities support the needs of such vulnerable populations. We have partners that have helped train communities that have been vulnerable to conflict and to displacement to be prepared when necessary to flee. And our partners have provided training for communities to have escape plans, evacuation routes, run bags, and in one recent case, that training was actually utilized just a day or so after it was received. And that training also looked at how to care for the elderly, how to make sure that we're caring for the needs of the children and the elderly as people flee.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me tackle the child soldiers question first. I don't think there is a really reliable number of the numbers that have been recruited, because a lot of children who have ended up in the conflict have been parts of militias and other groups such as the infamous New Era White Army, which is really a traditional hunting band which has been suborned at times in this conflict in support of the opposition. But clearly, when we look at a DDR program, one of the first actions, and where we would like to have U.S. Participation in early intervention, is in identifying child soldiers and getting them separated and out and into some sort of psychosocial counseling so they can be reintegrated into society. Child soldiers
for counseling?
The capacity in country does not. We would have.
Is it even close? I mean, how quickly could that be stood up?
you'd have to bring in outside experts to work on this and find people in South Sudan who have some rudimentary skills and work with them to add to that. But this whole question of child soldiers is something that I engaged with the Minister of Defense on even before this conflict broke out. And I think we had a commitment from the government at that point, and they were working toward actually tackling this problem in a serious way. The conflict obviously set that back. The question about measures to take if the leaders don't cooperate. I mentioned in my oral remarks that really we have sort of everything on the table. We're prepared to look at sanctions. We're prepared to look at an arms embargo. I think one of the key elements, though, is what I discussed, which is we really want to make sure that that resources of the country are going to be utilized for the people of the country. And so we're taking a careful look at what has been stolen in the past and who stole it. So we are definitely going to pursue that.
If I could interrupt briefly, is Enough's project of help to you, this Century, their project are you working with them on that?
We certainly are working with them. They have shared information with us. We have been discussing this with them. I think it's a good information collection gathering effort, but we now need to take that forward in ways that the U.S. government is uniquely qualified to do, whether it's through our FinCEN at Treasury, which looks at this issue on a systemic basis, or through the Department of Justice, which would look at things in an individual case basis. And there's also executive order that gives us the ability to deny visas to people that are involved in corruption as well. So there are a number of tools out there.
So you have sufficient authority for tools to hold individuals to account?
We have a broad range of tools that we can use should people be backsliding. The other big tool that we can use, frankly, is going to be getting those countries in the region who have no interest in having a failed state on their border to put their own pressures on. And often that is much more effective than what we can do from the U.S. This gets to the question about the unchecked greed and corruption. Again, we're trying to tackle that in two ways. One is looking at what's happened in the past, but more importantly, as I said in my remarks, we want to make sure that this government, there is transparency in its public finances. And we have already put the existing government as well as the opposition before they came together on notice that we would be looking for some sort of expenditure control mechanism to be in place. Otherwise, it would be very difficult to justify putting additional resources in support of stabilization of the macroeconomy. So that's a push we've been working with our international partners on. We've had a number of meetings, most recently last month here in Washington with key donors. And then on the events in the Security Council about the arms embargo last month. At that time, the focus of the efforts was to ensure that former Vice President Machar returned to Juba and the transitional government was stood up. And so the idea was not to punish for the fact that it wasn't stood up, but to encourage the parties to get it formed and to implement the peace agreement. And so we looked at what we could do that would have an impact that would incentivize both sides. And there the embargo actually came up short because it would incentivize the government much more, which could have led to greater resistance from the opposition. And so that was the problem that we were dealing with at the time. Now that they are one government, it should be easier to exert some of those types of pressures.
A deployment of 13,000 peacekeepers, is that about right? Is it enough?
The UN increased the peacekeeping ceiling to 12,500 troops in December of 2013, and then added another 500 to the ceiling in December of 2015. Those troops have not been found and recruited yet to deploy to the mission. And it took about 18 months to even do the first bump up. So there is a problem of finding people, troop contributing countries. And I think the role of the UN mission, a protection of civilians, will begin to change with the transitional government. With a transitional government that's functioning, you should have people beginning to feel safe that they can now leave these UN camps, can begin to leave the IDP camps and go home. And that will also be the main thing, I think, that will alleviate the humanitarian crisis facing the country.
Thank you. Ranking Member Bass.